So I just wanted to maybe set the scene for us before we start tonight. I mean, last year, if you had said to me, what are the schools of tomorrow? I would have thought of, the Jetsons, or I would have thought of the Matrix, where you could download skills to be a kung fu master and astrophysicist in about 35 seconds. But COVID-19 has really changed the landscape this year. And I think the pandemic has absolutely forced probably the biggest rethink of education in history around the world. It's triggered almost overnight, I would say probably one of the biggest ed tech implementations ever. And it's raised some pretty huge practical and logistical issues for students, teachers, parents. Certainly those of you here who are parents know that viscerally. But I also think it's opened up a world of opportunities for us to reimagine what school, teaching, learning can be in the 21st century. Now, I think we all have a conception of education that's pretty anchored in our own time in school, which could be over 20 years ago. Stephen and I have talked about that in the past. So tonight, I'm hoping that everybody can kind of break out. We can all free ourselves from those preconceived kind of mental models of what school was, and maybe discuss what school could and should be. So to our panelists tonight, I'd love to start off to ask each of you, you know that the Jetsons and the Matrix came to mind, the school of tomorrow. But what came to you when we first started talking about schools of tomorrow or the school of the future? Summer, I might start with you.
School of tomorrow, school of the future. Look, I think, Luther, I agree with you that we had these concepts that it would be school in the cloud, that we'd have, multi-campus across the world. And there were already some emerging examples that were really taking off there. You asked me today, sitting in this seat here, and I feel like the school of tomorrow, they're intimate learning communities that do have different kind of timetables, that are a little bit maybe like a departure lounge. And Stephen, I know you and I have talked about that for years and years. We're really seeing asynchronous learning come to the forefront. Sorry to use a term that has been thrown around school land for the past couple of weeks strongly. But for me, it really is. They're intimate learning communities. They have an anchor in space and place where people do come together like Basecamp and also manage their time in clever and creative ways. That's what comes to my mind as a school of the future at this moment in time.
Yeah, that collaboration element, Shane, over to you. When I think of Mathletics, especially in the early days and some of the things you've done, collaboration and the league tables and everything else was a super part of that. And I think what you were trying to create as kind of that school of future, if I'm not mistaken.
I mean, it was of sorts. I'd always go back to the outcomes that we want to achieve. What's our whole purpose here? And fundamentally, it's to prepare kids for the world that they're being thrust into. And I think first and foremost, that has changed so much to the world that we entered when we left school. The rate of change at this stage is simply unprecedented. And so that preparation for that world, so that they're able to compete in the global world, to get jobs, to be happy, the mindfulness that comes in, and so on. So that hasn't changed, except for the need has got greater. In terms of with the whole pandemic and everything, that's brought a sharper focus. It's definitely brought an immediate need in terms of the technology. Clearly, if the pandemic had occurred 20 years ago, our outcomes through this time would be vastly inferior. But having said that, I think if we look across the world, there's many sort of highly developed countries where their educational outcomes sort of since March have been pretty poor. And so on. I mean, especially the Northern Hemisphere ones, which limped through to the summer vacation. And so that's definitely accelerated change, but it may also set it back, because of course the rapid change, the inadequacies and the challenges to overcome, and thrown in by the very real aspect of the community, which we've tried to sort of do as best we can over this period, but it's still a clear loss. So what happens next and so on, I think there's a lot of question marks about it.
How about you, Eddie? What is the school of the future kind of sitting? How does that sit in your mind? You're in schools every day. You're driving a lot of this change. So.
Yeah, look, I feel very fortunate, certainly in a room, in a floor like this. This is a time when being in schools, I think we've all realized what a luxury and privilege that is. I think often it's easy to forget that. And I think about my year 12s who, when I saw them today, I thought to myself, okay, you guys are, Summer, you said asynchronous. Probably the only word that's been thrown around education circles more than that is unprecedented.
Yes.
We're so, are we all looking forward to being back in precedented times?
I
think that, especially where you are, Summer. I think about how this has, number one, like I've kind of unwittingly been preparing for this moment for the last 7 or so years, in that, teaching via a camera lens like I am, sort of right now. That's something which has become a natural medium for me. But at the same time, I feel as though it's given us a newfound sense of appreciation for the things that technology can and can't do, or the things it's well suited to and isn't well suited to. I think a lot of people get surprised when they hear that, because they're like, you're the technology guy, like that's how you've made your name or whatever it is. But for me, the thing that I sense more and more that we need to make sure we capture is that we don't look at anything, whether it's a technology or a pedagogical framework or a program or whatever it happens to be. Nothing is the silver bullet. Nothing is our savior here. There's got to be an overlap between the combinations of all these things that when, I think of the school of the future, this is going to sound strange, but I think there should be something very ancient about it. I really hope that people rediscover the power of something as ancient as Socratic questioning. Like, I don't know that we've ever bested those ancient Greeks when they worked out. This is a phenomenal way to really question the assumptions that you make about everything and get yourself to a point of existential crisis, perhaps, but then to come from that to really, really deeply learn something. So I really hope that we bring together the future and the past in terms of where we're headed from this moment in COVID, whatever the new business as usual will become. I hope we don't lose or don't forget the things that centuries have taught us about human nature and what good, effective teaching and learning looks like.
Eddie, I've got to jump in with a quote that I wrote down earlier, that the past is only the future with the lights on. And it makes me think of that. So, yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Very nice.
I love that. I love that. Stephen, how about you? You've had school and been an innovative leader in schools in Australia and now in Barcelona, and you're really kind of transporting that vision that you have of what the future school looks like. And I know this has been a conversation of ours many times, but maybe just give us, what's your take on the school of the future?
Yeah, I think I would start with the phrase that I most hate about schools of today or the schools of the past, and that is, they're separate from the real world. The people that talk about, when you get into the real world, I really, really dislike that statement. So for me, the school of the future is completely different, because we're not going to teach kids communication skill, collaboration, critical thinking, coping with change, complexity, unless we completely change the model of schooling and we place the learning communities into a community. So that for me, at the heart of what we have to do in the future is relationship, and we're not going to do that seriously unless we start getting rid of the word school, we get rid of the word education, we get rid of all of the words that have held us back, because the school of the future, if I use the word school there again, is about a learning community which is completely embedded and grown in a village.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, I've always kind of liked the word school just from a nostalgic point of view, and it's been around obviously as a German word, I think, since like the 17th century. But if I think of all the skills and tasks that we have that are now being kind of automated through things like AI, you're right, school starts to become almost maybe a silo. And the key is, what are those human-centric skills that we have? Maybe back to what you said, Eddie, about, you know, the unexamined life. You know, what are those skills that we as humans have? So how can schools build those human-centric skills? You know, we think about technology and everything else, but it's really our advantage as humans over the machines is that we're human, and that's what school should, I suppose, really focus on. Shane, what are your thoughts on that?
Look, I absolutely agree. I think it has to come from top down, however. So the schools are constrained by the syllabuses that they have to operate under, and so on. And you know, I personally believe that we're in need of fundamental change, because most of those syllabi have been created long ago, and any adaptations to them have been tweaks rather than significant changes. And ask ourselves the fundamental question: are we best preparing the kids for the world they're going into? So,
so how do we align? How do we align that those learning mechanisms more closely to that future of work in schools?
Do you mind if I just, Shane, your point? Sorry, this is one of the trickiest things about being over the other end of a camera lens, right? But I just think, Shane, something you said really struck a chord with me when you mentioned that there's got to be that top-down. There has to be some deep structural change, because I think that we often would love for there to all just be like grassroots. Like we can, you know, in many ways, the conversations we're having right now are people who are at the coalface, like you said, Luther, and are making that change happen. But those big structures up above, they constrain our activity in many ways. I wonder if, because I don't think you meant, Shane, that we shouldn't have any sort of bottom-up approach to this at all. There's got to be this sense of us all putting our oars in the water at the same time. Otherwise, we just end up going in circles, right? Like that's literally what happens.
Yeah, completely. And I mean, Stephen, I don't know if you remember, I visited your school a few years back and so on, and what you're doing there was absolutely amazing. And I wish it was a real beacon, and I wish that that was occurring across sort of all schools and so on. So that sort of change is very slow and often dies and so on when key people leave. And so I still believe that there does need to be that change from above that gives especially the permission for everyone sort of at all levels then to really align in that manner. So
I think there is a way ahead as we sort of transition from now into the future, which is obviously happens as soon as we finish this program. I think, you know, what would happen if every school leader, every school community measured their choices about what the school of the future looks by its impact on the well-being of the community. So if we took that as the core of the decision process, it would become a lot easier to work out what got chucked out and what got changed.
And the time is ripe for that. You've only got to look at, say, a brilliant survey that was conducted by Pivot PL that surveyed, you know, thousands of teachers responded to it in COVID, in lockdown one, when everyone was in lockdown in Australia. And the biggest factor there, concerns from teachers, from system leaders, parents and students, was this concept of wellness and well-being. And so where I think we go back to, Stephen and I agree on, is that school, or whatever we call the structure of that, is very much based in learning and very much a human-based organisation. Now, to be able to harness that, the biggest risk that we've got right now is the snapback, the nostalgic snapback. And I'm not saying, you know, looking into the past and looking at some really big notions that we could bring into the future, but I mean in that craving for that precedented times that we may actually get nostalgic for the wrong things and snap back. So the work that I'm doing with systems and with schools at the moment is really that bravery in saying, let's keep that stretch and let's be really, really brave around what is uncomfortable now has become more comfortable in lockdown, that might actually become our paradigm of how we can actually start to pull those levers. You know, systems are starting to see that there's no choice but to enable some technologies that teachers are saying this works better. They're understanding that friction cost between some of those tensions they had, maybe lockdown around safety before, and actually the need to open things up because great learning was happening as a result, and the re-professionalization of teachers coming along with that. You know, I think that's how we're humanizing things, by saying, ooh, we've all gone through this together, and actually we had to do some emergency stuff that's now actually saying that's quite cool. Now let's use that design mechanism, and what else might we be able to tinker with? It's very, very, very cool. But wellness at the
I think some of you are exactly right. Like
Go, Eddie.
I know that, sorry, I think I've lost everyone for a second, but I know that, thanks, Summer. One of the things which our students pointed out here in New South Wales when they came back from, that first initial lockdown where we were all there, there were several students who said, actually, you know, there's a certain democratization that happens through technology that they were very, very sad to miss, actually. And, you know, this really spoke to me, because I remember very much being a student, 15, 16 years old, heavily introverted within the classroom context. I was never the kid who got the teacher's attention or really felt comfortable interacting with them when I had serious questions or areas where I needed that help. And for some of our students to actually say, you know what, I know this sounds weird, but when we were not in the room and when all of our interaction was mediated through this way, of course, there were some things that we lost, but there was also this tremendous equity in the access that we got. And I know I've spoken to Adrian Pickley, who used to be the Minister for Education here in New South Wales. He's based out in Griffith, which is a long way away from metropolitan Sydney. And he was kind of delighted that in this new world where everyone is appearing on, you know, the evening news, commenting on education via Zoom, there is this real equality across the system that we can actually say, no, we're all on equal footing here. So I completely agree, Summer. That's something I think we should jealously hold on to and not let go back to the status quo.
Yeah, if I think about technology, the holy grail for technology across so many applications over the last 10 years and longer has been the personalization of whatever technology touches. And it kind of speaks to that democratization. And, you know, if we think about technology being able to personalize studying, learning for students, really to their own level of mastery, whether they're in kindergarten or they're in grade 12. You know, does that speak to the fact that maybe in the School of the Future, and I know we have one question on this thread, that needs to be different versions of schools, and needs to be different different models, or almost the multiplicity of models of learning? Do we need to break the School of the Future? Sorry, Stephen, break the School of the Future up so that we have all these different modalities? Stephen, what are your thoughts on that?
I think absolutely. I had a really interesting chat with Professor Yong Zhao earlier last year, where we both attacked the word personalised learning, because by implication, personalised learning is still something that's done to a child. It's done by a teacher has decided what they should do. A computer algorithm has decided what they should learn. We should be proud in Australia that, I think it was two researchers from Melbourne back in the early 2000s, throwing another word here, the hoity-toity word, but the self-determined learning, came from that whole notion came from Australia. I think we've really got to say that the School of the Future should be broken up into self-determined segments, because we're not going to really prepare people for their future unless that happens. And if you think back, I can unfortunately think back 20 years, 40 years in schooling in Australia, and think about the enormous shifts in 2 decades apart. Now, for the parents who are now putting their kids into the education system now, there is no way that they can possibly think about what it's going to be like in 2 decades' time. And, for heaven's sakes, don't worry about exams, assessment, and all of that sort of stuff, because the world that your kids have to prepare for is going to need that self-determination, the self-direction. So I think for me, it's about breaking up the entire school system to enable that personal to come forward.
Mm-hmm. Summer, you're a designer. You design education, right? I'm not even sure what that means. I'm just saying the words. But if we need to move from kind of a process-based learning to maybe a problem-based, or the kind of activity-based learning that I think Stephen's talking about, where every kid is kind of able to self-determine their direction. What do we have to what does school have to look like?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I think it's probably less around what it has to look like, but what do we have to ask and know, and what are the resources and tools that we have to have? So, young people need to be able to know what's possible. They need to be able to ask questions around how might they like to spend their days, and to be exposed to a whole range of different ways that can happen. Then they start to say, well, that's interesting because this is what I might need in order to go down that track. So some of the work I'm doing in the Northern Territory at the moment is quite interesting with some primary schools, where we give them their school data. We give them all of the data. And then we give them the skills to be able to interrogate that data, qualitative, quantitative, how secure is this data, and why do you care? So, there are young people who are 10 years old looking at literacy in year 3, improving literacy. And I'm there asking them the questions, why do you care? Who cares? Why should I care if you and your friends know how to read? And Stephen, you'd love this, that it ultimately gets down to this fact that they're saying, but if my friend can't read, they feel bad about themselves and they don't come to school. And when my friend doesn't come to school, my day is worse off. And I say, now I care. So what are we going to do about it? And then to have a whole range of partners who are ready to catch what they say we're going to do. And actually these students and their teachers are on an equal playing field around decisions. It's part of that Harris Commission work out of the UK, and they're able to then make recommendations to the minister. It then goes into the school improvement plans for the next year. So that sort of thing is less around what does the school look like. The function of what they do to personalize their journey is around who is around them. When does that take place? The questions and how we can actually catch what it is that they do and make sense of it alongside them, with them, and for them. Because too often they can go through a design process, they can make a really nice artifact, and we say, that's really cool, a beautiful piece of work. Now what? There's space for beautiful work. It shouldn't just be about this utility factor of how is this going to help me in the future? Sure. But we also need to make commitments to young people that when they decide this is an education worth having, this is what I want my days in learning to look like and post-school, that we're ready to say, well, here's a whole bunch of people that are ready to walk with you. And here's a whole bunch of opportunities that we are opening up to you as well.
So back to the community, back to the people around them, the teachers, the education systems.
It's flooding their lives with people who want to go on that long walk with them, that have high expectations for them, and that have opportunities there that they're continually brokering on behalf of young people. Stephen, it's not sort of saying, hey, I've got this opportunity, you should take it, but to have that self-awareness in students to say, great, that looks like something I'd like to do, thanks, but no thanks, is really ace.
I think you've got to make some really tough decisions at times. This is when I confess to Eddie and to Shane with your mathematics backgrounds. One of the biggest challenges we had in Barcelona for the kids coming into our program was that they universally all hated maths. And so we were actually forced to stop doing maths for a while. But what was interesting was it was only probably 3 or 4 months before they started to say, can we do this? Can we have a workshop on that? And now some of the kids are deep diving into stuff that, it was way beyond school level. So I guess that decision, which we didn't find very difficult to make in our context in Barcelona, because we could just make it, was to say, all right, we've got to actually reboot it, and rebooting it sometimes means you've actually got to get rid of it. Yeah. And then I do it.
Sammy, you said something I think really important there in terms of the high expectations. I think often our expectations are actually too low, and they're achieved, or even those ones aren't achieved. So if I can sort of go back to the school of the future, one of the things I would hope for would be high expectations.
Maybe that's a good moment as well to say that, like, that school of the future, I feel like one of its core characteristics has to be something that someone just articulated so well. Like when you said, like, you got to ask that driving question and say, Yes, but why? But why? And so I guess that's really saying that our education has to be purpose-driven. And I think that's probably why, I think, Stephen, you're exactly right, that a word like school has become in and of itself, well, you just go to school because you go to school. And so we've lost track of why this is something which we think as a society and a culture is worth doing. It's illegal to not send your children to this hallowed place, but we have forgotten as an institution why that is the case. It's where, tradition gives way to traditionalism, and we just kind of accept it. And I suppose it's when it becomes the air that you breathe. And mathematics is the perfect example, right? Like, we are so, probably after a kid is 6 or 7 years old, maybe even slightly earlier than that. This goes to your top-down point before, Shane, that the curriculum actually is not really structured to ever pose students that question. Why is this worth learning? It just kind of says, just trust me for the next 11 years or more. And often for many students, never ever actually pays off that trust if it was ever given. And that's heartbreaking. It shows that there is that top-down change that needs to happen at a curriculum and a syllabus level. Because unlike you, Stephen, in Barcelona, we can't just all switch off the tap and then realize, oh no, this is worth doing after all.
Yeah.
And Eddie, I mean, one of the issues that we face in mathematics and so on, and I mean, it's not dissimilar to what you're saying there, Stephen, in Barcelona, is the culture of the country is not generally it doesn't have overly high expectations on mathematics. There's so many parents that will say to their children oh yes, I was terrible at maths, or I hated maths, and so on. And so they're incredibly permissive to their children, that then that's fine, and it's becoming intergenerational and so on. So it's one of the features that we have here as a society now. So schools are not in isolation and so on. So that's a hard one to change. It's very different to an Asian mentality and so on, that it is so sort of prevalent there. Now, I'm not saying that we need to swing fully, and because it won't happen, but in terms of schools being reflective of the society and trying to lift those expectations and so on. But it's a particular issue in mathematics.
Well, it's interesting that we've had, let me see, almost half an hour of discussion about schools of the future, and nobody has mentioned iPads for every child, which is heartening. But there are a lot of things that seem to grab the headlines and certainly parents here, when they're looking at, what's the school of the future, and we're all laughing about the iPads in every child's hand. But we also have things like reduction in class sizes and a number of innovations that are meant to increase excellence and bring our schools into a best practice kind of scenario. But if you had to, each of you, just kind of nominate a couple of things, or one thing maybe, in your immediate experience that really can supercharge kids' learning and increase that level of excellence. The kind of excellence that we're looking for. What would it be? Maybe Stephen, starting with you.
I'll use another little hyped word, the agency word. At the moment you can get the kids understanding what they can do, that they will hypercharge it themselves. And if I use my experience from sub-Saharan Africa there as well, where you've got the entire education system collapsed because of COVID in terms of kids just haven't gone to 6 months. There are kids there who know how to use technology. They know how to use their mobile phone to still learn, and they're actually learning more probably when they have that access from different computer programs and different conversations and social media than they would have been actually learning in the classroom in the first place. So I think the answer for me is that the more we can empower the kids to be resilient and creative, the more they will actually then find their own pathway through the journey. And I think that for me is, I think, what would have happened if we'd actually taught kids resilience and creativity and initiative as 4, 5, and 6 year olds. And if we'd been doing that for the last 10 years, would we have had a very different outcome during COVID? I suspect yes.
Eddie, how about you? What do you think? What is your response to that?
How much time do we have on this panel left again?
You've got 13 and a half seconds. No.
Sure. Great. Thanks a lot, Luther. Look, if I had to pick one, I'll pick one thing. And I promise I'm not just picking this because I happen to be leading an initiative that does exactly this within the New South Wales Department of Education. But with that sort of prologue out of the way, one of the things that I think really does supercharge learning in a school is something which I think we all know is kind of self-evidently obvious that we need to do. And yet, just like flossing our teeth, we somehow still find a way to make excuses for ourselves and not do it. And that is especially in high school, because I think primary schools generally run rings around us secondary teachers in this regard. In their colleagues' classrooms. Now, this is such a simple, ridiculous thing. Like I said, it's like on the level of floss your teeth so that your teeth don't fall out. But to me, it's shocking that, you know, I remember a few years ago when the Department of Education in New South Wales rolled out a mandated 2 observations a year for every classroom teacher to maintain their accreditation at proficient level. And there were people up in arms, setting things on fire. They were like, you can't like challenge my piece and my professionalism as a classroom teacher. And I thought to myself, wait a second, what, like, this is insane to me. This is early in my career that this was first introduced. And I thought, how else do you improve if you are not actually engaging deeply with the practice of your colleagues and seeing the things that you cannot see in yourself by being observed by your colleagues and seeing the way other people do things? Now, for me, that's just kind of, shouldn't that be just situation normal? But the reality is you actually have in high schools teachers who for years they'll close the door and their classroom practice is their own. And that's just, that's endemic in terms, especially going to point the finger right this way, in a space like mathematics, which is so, frankly, inscrutable to so many other people. They're like, goodness, man, I have no idea what that means. I'm in no position to challenge that, to push it in one way or another. There is no space more ignored, I think, than education research and what we know good teaching and learning looks like in the classroom. It's there, documented, and it's ignored. And I think we really need to, like, it truly would, I think, supercharge pedagogy in schools and therefore learning if we just got in everyone's classrooms every day and made that a regular practice.
Community within a community, real community, not little fiefdoms. Yeah, that makes sense.
Imagine if teachers were taught the same way as they do MBAs in collaborative teams. What would happen if teachers were actually work together?
You know, I'm seeing that in terms of some efficiencies, particularly in COVID, where we're now seeing, you know, English departments rally and actually look at who's creating this content, who's looking at this skill. Like, as a matter of efficiency, it's now changed the way that's happening. Eddie, I could not agree more. For me, I think it's the fact that the education of young people needs to become everyone's business. And I love how EdTechs are coming into this space. I love that we're having this conversation, you know, hosted by not an education department. I mean, it really gives me life that now this is the business of school and education and learning is so, when I say business, I mean, you know, the daily, what we do with it, the how we do things is becoming so interesting to everyone. We often say to these young people that we're working with, particularly in the Northern Territory, that they view more lessons than any other teacher. So why wouldn't we tell them what good teaching and learning looks like, sounds like, and feels like? Open up great feedback. I mean, that then opens up partnerships. So again, for me, it's around how we can get more people, clever people, in front of teachers, in front of kids, putting in resources, putting in ideas, and it becomes normal that everyone's involved in that educative process. That would just be an absolute delight, an absolute delight.
That's amazing. That's good. Now, I know that we are halfway through, and we have a bunch of questions that I think I'm just going to pop right onto our table here.
Okay.
Can I just jump in one tick, Luther?
Yes, please.
Because I do want to say, fully agree with Stephen and Eddie. But the one thing I've got to put forward is great ed tech and so on, because I think that is, I mean, you know, that's what I'm passionate about. I spent the last 17 years of my life banging on in terms of it and that sort of stuff. And there is some unbelievable materials out there. However, many of them barely see the light of day. it is incredibly hard for edtech companies to come through with really good solutions. So I certainly hope that that it becomes easier, and then it's all based on, well, what are the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, and so on. So that's coming from the schools and the departments, and whatever those outcomes are, whether that happens to be well-being or whether that happens to be, you know, best possible maths results, whatever. But once those outcomes are set, then how can the technology supercharge and assist? And I agree with what Eddie said before. There's no silver bullet, but brilliant technology is, I believe, the sort of greatest gift that's been given to education in terms of what can be achieved. You know, in Australia, we spend, on average, the government spends $20,000 a year educating each child, and so on. The amount that may go to educational software and so on is probably less than $50. And so on, and within there. And in terms of return on investment and so on, there's so much more that is possible. But as long as it's pegged back to good outcomes. And so we don't want rubbish technology in there. We want, whatever those outcomes are, then try to get those solutions to enhance and supercharge teachers and learning.
One of the things that's become clear during COVID is that, especially with children being at home, there's been almost a bifurcation in society where the haves and the have-nots, to a certain extent, especially with technology, availability of internet and infrastructure and things like that, we've started to see that in a little bit of that inequity kind of starting to creep in. That maybe even is to a certain extent driven even more so by the technology. We do have a question about from one of the participants about how can we continue to improve the access to equitable education opportunities in the future. And I suppose thinking about this from the lens of technology into classrooms, is this going to help us, hinder us? What do we have to be careful of? Maybe back to you, Shane, to start this off. Just your thoughts on that.
Well, my thoughts on it are that again, something Eddie said before, the democratization that occurs, that the opportunity for these socioeconomically disadvantaged to be equalized here is so much there. In terms of, if you look at technology, I mean, the Chromebooks and so on, for a couple of $100, you can have a really good computer and so on, and the sorts of things that can be created and so on that are there. So I think the opportunity is enormous, but I mean, sometimes it's very hard. And I'll go back to something I tried to pull together sort of in 2010 and 11, really tried to pull together a complete free solution in terms of working with the government and so on, where you're able to build the most amazing things that would cost really less than $100 per school to go out in terms of, and the outcomes there. Now, okay, alternatively, you can have a business model which costs schools somewhere to use the software somewhere between sort of $3,000 and $50,000, and that's not an equitable approach. There are equitable scenarios if that's what the sort of the country or the education department sort of want to try to bring about. But one of the problems is, in general, from an EdTech perspective, it's very much a school by school approach or a teacher by teacher approach. Mm-hmm. And often that for EdTech companies, then sort of 75% or more of their costs go in sales and marketing as opposed to creating and deployment and so on. And so we're losing that opportunity for the democratization. But I still go back. One of the things that we did in Uganda that was tremendously sort of rewarding in terms of $70 tablets shared amongst sort of 10 kids and so on, and these kids had never seen a plane or anything, or let alone a computer. Now the tablets, in that sense, with some good software on it and learning experiences, was wonderful outcomes. So I'm convinced that sort of we can dramatically improve education if we gain more benefit from the technology. But definitely am not advocating that it's a technology driven or technology only solution. And the goals of the technology should still be set by the outcomes that the schools or the education departments are trying to achieve.
Yeah,
it's one of those areas where if you can do research in countries where the teaching standard is not the best, and then see how technology is being used to overcome that disadvantage. Now, the teaching standards might not be the best, not because of the quality of the people, but the lack of training in most cases. If I think about some of the countries where I've been to, where teachers actually, they just call themselves a teacher. There's no training in that. But it is interesting then to see when you put the technology into the hands of the learners, when they haven't got that mentor or coach to help them, that they're finding the ways to use the technology to overcome the disadvantage. So it would be really interesting research to sort of try and focus on that area to say what aspects of the technology do the kids most prefer when they actually haven't got the teacher tap.
Remember what Sagata Mitra said a while ago, there was a really great micro documentary on exactly what we're talking about here. And he had this provocation that the internet in the hands of the child, along with the absence of the teacher, can be a pedagogical tool. And I remember a lot of teachers like, hang on a second, and it made it rethink. Well, you know, really, that's very true, that they can work it out. There was the hole in the wall experiment that was wonderful that he did. And to then be saying, Eddie and Shane and Stephen, I think we all agree around sort of a crowded curriculum, and we can go down that path, but, you know, it is what it is. He also then said, you know, once upon a time we had to teach young people how to shoot a gun and ride a horse because they needed that to stay alive. But now that's sport. Like, what if arithmetic were a sport? What if handwriting becomes an art form? It's almost like actually reshuffling and reimagining, matching that in with technology. And we have a really interesting way of reimagining content, which is also beautiful in and of itself.
And I would say, like, when you were talking about Sagata Mitra just then, I was like, oh, of course, like the teachers, and this is part of the reason why I think, Stephen, you're right to say, let's try and unshackle ourselves from our concept of school, which is almost impossible when we just open our lips and say school, and we already have a picture in our minds. Like that, like you were saying, some of the teacher getting out of the way, like that's got to be one of the principal things I have learned accidentally. I'd love to take credit for having planned this, but, you know, after having a YouTube channel, which has been, you know, watched and subscribed to as much as it has been, for me, one of the most amazing things that stands out is only 13% of the people who actually watch, you'll forgive me for going for the numbers because it's very on brand, right? But only 13% of those people are actually school-aged. The other 87% are people who are either below or above school age, who are kind of like, they're not having a teacher set this for them. There's curiosity there. There's that, I guess, Stephen, like you sort of experienced in Barcelona. We want to learn this, actually. This helps me operate and function in my life. Like, there are these COVID charts that are just being thrown up and saying we should open or not reopen or whatever. And I'm without hands and feet to interpret this stuff. I need these mathematical tools and skills. So I guess there's this huge, like, what would learning look like if there really wasn't, if we just sort of snapped our fingers and every teacher disappeared? The learning clearly would not stop. So I think it's incumbent on us who are in this space to be able to say, can we take the courage, can we have the courage to reimagine that while we're still here, while we have that vested interest at the same time?
And love to professionalize teachers as well. Like Khan Academy, you know, a free world-class education for everybody. I mean, have those big expectations, as we were saying, Shane, of our ed techs and of our systems to say, you know what, we can't do this alone. Like, it's all of us saying, let's all bunker in and get this done. I know that's altruistic and hopeful, but Eddie, like, what an awesome provocation to say, all right, let's rethink curriculum differently. Let's rethink ourselves, right? That's a cool thing.
Well,
I might pull out
and that's the concept that you're saying, that the age of your viewers is actually way older than teenagers. is that lifelong learning is the new school of the future. I mean, when we're talking about it, is that we really have to stop the notion that schooling only happens from 5 till 17 or 18. It's going to be going from 0 to 100, and communities have to reimagine everything from technology, communities, so that can actually continue to happen.
Yeah, it's, it's one thing that we are doing here, in a way, and it's a Canadian metaphor, we're skating around the edge of the pond here on a little bit of thin ice. And if we had, all the parents in the country around us, and, we have some questions in the Q&A panels as well. If we move away from that, if we waved our magic wand and all the teachers were gone, or all the teachers were in a different position, right? I think it was you, Summer, that said all the teachers are gone. The learning would still happen. But the question is, for a lot of people, and I think parents especially after COVID or during COVID, is school provides for a lot of people that sense of structure and discipline in kids' lives, for better or for worse. And obviously, from my perspective, it's a very industrial kind of 19th century concept. But what do we risk? We've talked about a little bit about the things that we've gained. What are the things that we might risk in that? Now, Pete's saying that we've got another 30 minutes if we want it, and I don't usually trust him because he's usually not that nice to me. We at least have another 10 minutes. But what are the, if we start to move the school system, school structure away from what we traditionally have done over the last 200, 300, 400 years, what will be some of the pushback that we have, and what are the barriers that we have to overcome to get ourselves into a new paradigm? What are your thoughts, Stephen? Sorry, Eddie, you're sitting in both a school and a policy area as well.
Yeah, that's that's a really rich. Why did you have to ask that with 10 minutes to go, Letha? That's cruel. That's not cool, man. The first place my mind went was something that Stephen said earlier about the primacy of relationship in learning, and I think there's a huge danger that, well, of course, anytime we're considering big structural change, to get my my Elizabeth Warren inspiration on, I feel like we need to make sure that we don't, throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I know one of the greatest things, like I, grew up in an education paradigm that was all about, really pushing me up against worldviews, ways of thinking, values, and perspectives on the world that were completely different to mine. And I'm going to say that was to my benefit. It wouldn't feel comfortable at the moment that I experienced it, but it was phenomenally valuable. Even when I went to uni, it was quite a shock. Like, people said to me, "Oh, you'll be with people who have chosen to do the same thing as you. So where you always might have felt like a fish out of water at school, you'll finally find your tribe." And there was a sense in which that was true, but there was also a sense in which actually it was the exact opposite experience. It was my first encounter with people who were just as committed to students and communities of learning. I almost said the S word, Stephen, but I stopped myself. And yeah, their underlying assumptions about how the world functioned and how it should, the ways we can actually change it, were completely different to mine. And that was quite a shock. It was a really good shock. So I guess what I'm trying to say is a very long way to try and get at the point that we want to make sure that we are not losing that opportunity to be in contact with all those people like we are right this very second, which I think, so I'm going to say it, schools do a really good job at, or they have the capacity to do a really good job at, to be able to say, you know what, actually the little pinhole that you've been looking at the world through, we need to blow that open and help you see other perspectives on the problems that you need to solve and the ways that you can solve them.
I love that.
Awesome. I only have, Pete says we've only got a few more minutes here, so I am going to ask, and leave Eddie with that one. I just want to ask, I guess, each of the panel to give us and all the audience here, the one thing you would like to see in your learning community of tomorrow. because we're not using the S word anymore. I might, no pressure, but I'll start with you, Summer. What would you like to see, the one thing that you would like to see in your learning community of tomorrow?
Happy, well people. I mean, curious, happy, well people. That's it.
Awesome. Awesome. Shane, what would you like to see?
Engaged, excited learners, and so on, giving off electricity because they're absolutely loving what they're doing.
Fantastic. Eddie, you're next on my my with squares.
Oh man, I mean, I feel like I want Summer in that school, in that learning community. Actually, can we just take her and just put her there? You know, I want that community of I'm going to steal Stephen as well. That community of learners who are lifelong. We're here on a journey. Like I always tell my students, because sometimes, you know, students will rank up or rank down and shift classes around and that kind of thing. And I always say to them, you know, once you're my student forever. And once I get to have the privilege of teaching you, I get to, you know, take credit for everything great that you do and probably some of the awful things you do. But still to say, like, we're co-learners on this journey for the next 10, 20, 30, however many years that we get. I think that would be really exciting, that it's not just these 6 years or 13 that I get with you. I get to go on this with you forever, how many years we get together.
Awesome. Stephen.
I'm not sure. My screen has actually gone into a part slowdown there for.
We can hear you.
I'll just talk.
You're fine. Go for it, Stephen.
In terms of what I would see is critical, I guess, a bit like Summer. I want to see people flourishing, and the flourishing is happening because of the fact that they feel completely part of that community. And I think it's not impossible when you do start challenging all of the aspects of schooling that that you've never really thought through. And I guess one of the things that I've loved, a little anecdote from Barcelona, was a young guy who came and joined us, and he looked in shock at the end of the first week. And I said, and with my broken Spanish and his broken English, we worked out his shock was he'd never actually seen teenagers communicate with adults in a rational, loving way. And so I guess that really hit to me the dysfunction that's actually happening in our kids' lives and in the societies. It could be in the schools, could be the families, could be elsewhere. And the sheer delight when kids suddenly see that they're actually allowed to flourish and to be themselves.
Awesome.
That's amazing.
Well, listen, thank you, Shane, Stephen, Summer, and Eddie. You've been amazing. I think your ideas have all opened all of our eyes to what school could be, maybe even how we get there. I suppose one of my hopes is that every student coming through now and in the future, that learning community will always be able to look back at each stage in their life, whether they're 15 or whether they're 50, and be able to always have somebody there to whom they can look up to as a mentor, as a coach, as a teacher, who makes their life better. So thank you very much for that. And I suppose I just want to thank all of the everyone in the audience tonight. Now, we didn't get to all of your questions, but thank you for the questions, your interest, your contribution by your participation to the Future Minds program. I'd love it if I think we've got a little bit of time to network and have virtual drinks. So if our panel sticks around and finds a table, I suggest that you seek them out and ask any questions that you had or didn't get answered. And with that, I will pass the talking stick back to you, Pete.
Thank you so much, Luther.
Thanks, Luther.
Thank you, Luther.
One of the things that I like to do at at our events and in my classes is ask people to post in the chat, what's one thing that you'll take away from tonight's discussion? It's just a really great way to reward the panelists, to see what kind of messages hit home. So I invite you to take a minute now just to type in the chat one thing you'll take away from this evening. Do you want to also thank...
While you do that, just saying there were a lot of really awesome conversations in the Q&A, and I'm happy to take that up with folks if they wanted to have a chat about one or more of those questions. Twitter's probably the best place to find me, at EduSum.
Thank you so much.
Well,
Yeah, if you want to post your Twitter handles in the chat so people can find you, same for Eddie and Stephen and Shane. Shane, do you want to quickly plug something while you're still here? What you working on at the moment? No.
Oh, well, we're excited by it in terms of just trying to create an environment where kids, in this case, that might not like writing, we're trying to create a situation where they do like to write and they see themselves as writers. And so, one of the disappointing things that I find in that it seems more than half of primary school students don't see themselves as writers. And so we'd love to change that.
That's amazing. Eddie, you've got a TV show and a book and YouTube channels.
Look, people can find them if they have, if they're interested in, if they've got kids who are interested in that kind of thing, they're more than welcome to join in. But really, like Summer said, I feel like this was the beginning of a conversation. There were so many things we didn't even get to touch. So I hope people get to reach out and continue that discussion, because it's some rich, fertile ground. And we will absolutely just kind of slide back into the way things were if we don't actively pursue them. So I hope this was really a spark for people to be thinking really hard tonight, and looking forward to interacting with people afterwards.
Legendary.
Awesome. I'll quickly go through my thank yous then. So we've thanked the panelists. I'll thank you to the Future Minds Accelerator startups for being here tonight, for the networking and for the chat. Thank you to Jacqueline from Venture Cafe Sydney for managing this virtual space and the event, and to Venture Cafe Sydney for hosting us in Remo. And to the team at Blue Chili, who I love working with, to Rio Tinto and AWS for all of your work behind the scenes for tonight's event, but for the Future Minds Accelerator program. This is our last public event for this program for this first year. So this has been amazing.